My name's Tim Besley, and I'd like to welcome you to this event to discuss fragile states. I have a couple of announcements to make before I give my formal welcome. Unfortunately, Paul Collier is unable to be with us today, but we will do our best to manage in his absence. This is an event co-organized by three groups, by the British Academy, where we are now, by CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, and the LSE-Oxford Fragile States Commission. For those of you who are not familiar with CIFAR, it is a Canadian-based institution that organizes frontier research of a generally interdisciplinary nature on a variety of topics, and the program that has put together today's event is the program in Institutions, Organizations and Growth. And I'm a proud member of that program. The reason it's relevant to today's presentation is many of the thoughts and ideas that are manifest in the findings of the Fragile States Commission are in one way or another influenced by the thinking of members of that group. So not only is it an organization which is bringing people together, but it's also an organization, I think, which is influencing the kinds of directions of thinking and ultimately perhaps policy in this area. My primary role today will be, since I won't be assuming, even though you can get hard copies of the report outside, that people who've come to this event have already read and digested and thought about the issues in the report. So I'm going to give you an overview of that. But before I do that, I'm going to hand over to Adnan Khan. Adnan, who's one of the co-chairs of the Commission and also the research director of the International Growth Center, which is a joint Oxford-LSE venture supported by the Department for International Development that has served as a kind of fertile ground in which the ideas of the Commission were developed and also to enable the Commission to operate. Adnan, as I said, was one of the three commissions, but I'll leave it to him to tell you a little bit about our motivation for setting up the Commission. Then I will come back and talk about its findings, and then Roger Myerson and Rachel Glennister will give some reactions to the ideas, and then finally we'll have a discussion and open it up to the floor. So you will have your opportunity to both state your question, to give comments, and to question the panel. So at this point, I'll hand over to Adnan, who's going to give you a bit of an introduction overview of the Commission.
Thank you, Tim. Wonderful to see so many people. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here talking about state fragility. And when we talk about state fragility, I think the single most important thing to note is where we are at this point in time. We are witnessing profound policy failure over the past few decades. So we are not presiding over success. So we must start with an admission, a sobering acknowledgement and admission of failure. What we have been doing is not working. And it's partly because of the way we have been working. For it's rare to see such a huge gap between, call it, what is professed and what is actually practiced. Between the rhetoric of ownership, not donorship, that is usually spelled out at conferences, and the reality of donor-imposed policy mandates, that too overloaded policy mandates imposed by donors, often backed with stringent policy conditionalities that are very hard for any government to deliver, let alone states with very limited capacity, states facing fragility. Yet the truth is, no country has lifted itself out of poverty based on the vision of external actors. They've done it themselves, often with external support, but not controlled by others. Yet the path out of fragility is not only important, but too important for global actors to neglect. It's not just because of the, call it, spillover effects, external effects on developed world, migration, security, and others, but primarily because the people living in fragile states deserve better. And it's not about money. If it were, Libya would be in a very different place today. And it's not just about strategy. There have been tons of reports on fragile states. So what is distinctive about our commission and our report? I personally think that it's because of the analytical framework that it's based on, that people like Tim, Paul, many people in this room, Robin, and others who were not directly part of the commission, but whose ideas were critical and provide a fertile ground on which we conducted our discussions. It's partly also because we were not held back by the visions of the past, by the strategies of the past. We took an approach that we need to be honest. If the current strategies are not working, we'll not hold back. I wouldn't name other strategies, but all the members of the commission were at attended several of those other reports, which have been filtered to death, hardly leaving anything innovative, substantive, or bold in those reports. I do think that we are not shying away from saying something which makes sense. Our report is also, I think, distinctive in the sense that we gathered a group of not only top academics, but also practitioners. We conducted about 20 country studies, several other studies on different topics. We conducted several open evidence sessions, and we conducted very open, very frank, candid discussions among ourselves. So I personally do think that we have something innovative to say. For the past few days, I was in Lebanon at a conference organized by donors on public sector reform. And it was sobering to note that every single thing that they were saying was basically a version of follow Denmark, copy Denmark. And if I were to describe the work of the Commission in one word, it is escaping the curse of Denmark. So Denmark didn't become Denmark through a very nice linear way. It had to struggle its own path out of its own fragility and to ultimately become Denmark. And just copying Denmark doesn't work. Each country, each state facing fragility has to evolve its own path out of fragility. External actors, analytical framework, evidence, all of those can help. But the struggle has to be owned by domestic actors. So in one way, in one word, what we are saying is restore sovereignty to where it belongs, to the people and the policy actors in fragile states. Let me stop here and then hand over to Tim, Professor Sir Tim Besley, so to go over the recommendations of the report in more detail, and before we have a discussion with other distinguished guests.
Thanks, Adnan. So, as Adnan showed you, there are a number of people involved in the commission, and it was chaired by our former Prime Minister, David Cameron. And we're currently, where the work is currently going is that we're trying to look at ways of trying to continue engaging in the policy discussion following on from the ideas of the Commission. I'll come to that very briefly at the end. But what I'm going to talk about today is kind of what we say in the report in a nutshell, but with a particular focus not on the analytical framework. So you'll find the report in a slightly it's developed in a slightly back-to-front way for those of you who actually read it. The first part is really a focus on the recommendations, and particularly policy recommendations. The second part is the analytical framework that we developed to support the policy recommendations. We deliberately put that after the recommendations because we really want people to start engaging with ideas ahead of having to wade through that. But anyway, I will talk mostly therefore about the recommendations. I think as Adnan already said, increasingly, international agencies in particular have recognized that the greatest attention needs to be paid to those places in the world where generating effective and sustainable development is most difficult. There have been successes in countries like China and India which have turned around their fortunes through developing new policy agendas, but increasingly it's there are a number of countries in the world where that hasn't been the case. The label state fragility seems to have caught on as a kind of catch-all for thinking about the places where development is particularly difficult. Because it stands for a number of different issues, and I'll unpack in a minute the way we thought it was useful to think about state fragility. One thing we resisted from the start, and a number of agencies have been doing this, is to create lists. So some people say, oh, so which is the list of fragile states in the world? And then they will be the countries in the world that are singled out for special measures, if you like, and are the focus of policy attention. And we think that's largely unhelpful. There are a number of countries in the world which we think have symptoms of fragility, but we don't think it's very helpful to start throwing around lists. We also think that talking about fragility as if it was a sort of 0-1 idea, which these lists encourage you to think in terms of, is not the right way forward. And so we entirely avoided heading down that route from the beginning and some people very early on wanted to push us in that direction, and we decided to resist. But there are plenty of people out there, and I'm not going to engage on that, have lists of fragile states, and are happy to tell you why they put countries on that list. Just another background thought that I want to table. I think there's an error in thinking about this, which says that if you only understood the root causes of state fragility, that would necessarily give you the answer of what to do about it. But let me show you why I think, just to give you an example of why I think that's wrong. Suppose we discover or we believe from our academic papers or wherever else that there are deep historical reasons why some countries are prone to fragility or not. I suspect that knowing that has only limited relevance, believing there are these root historical causes in the way we would choose to tackle the practical issues. And tempting though it is to want to always look for these root fundamental causes, it's not that obvious that they are always the key to how you want to proceed in policy terms. Another just sort of background comment I want to make is on the approach. It's become very clear in working on this just that one of the reasons why these are difficult issues is because they combine parts of government and parts of public action which are sometimes not as well joined up as we'd like them to be. There's the sort of statecraft and international relations elements. Countries that are, particularly once they get into situations of deep and sustained conflict, become the objects of interest for international departments in different countries. The State Department in the US, the Foreign Office in the UK, unavoidably, they become part of international statecraft. So there's the part of it that belongs there, and to different degrees and at different times, that is central to what those organizations do. The second area of government that gets heavily involved is, of course, those who have knowledge of development, the economy, and politics within different countries. And that would typically reside in the UK, it would be DFID's remit to support, particularly development. And then the third is concerns about security. Security is often, as I'm going to mention in a moment, a very serious issue in many countries. And often that part of government which is dealing with security is not necessarily well joined up to that part of government which is dealing with, for example, the analysis of economic development. Although increasingly, for those of you who've been following the literature in economics and political economy of development will be aware that it's become a central concern to try and study the implications around security as part of the study of economic development, but that's a comparatively recent development among economists, at least. Okay, before I come to the recommendations, which is the main thing I want to put on the table before we open our discussion, let me just begin by the way we were thinking about state fragility. And we came down to thinking there are basically 6 features that are manifest at different degrees in different places. The first is security. Some kind of security threat from organized non-state violence is often something that is closely associated with problems of state fragility. in other words, not having a state which in any way, shape or form has a monopoly of coercive force within the boundaries of that state is something that one often sees in situations of state fragility. The second is the government lacking legitimacy in the eyes of many of its citizens, making it difficult for the government to fulfill its normal operations in terms of citizen-government relations. I mean, an example would be modern-day Libya, which would be quite an extreme example, where effectively there is a government which is deemed legitimate in the eyes of its citizens, and another one that's deemed legitimate in the eyes of international community, and it's not clear what notion of legitimacy one would apply to that. The third, Adnan already touched on that, is the state has weak capacity to fulfill basic functions. That these are states that are struggling to deliver even the most basic services, to raise tax revenue, to enforce property rights, the core functions that we tend to think are the core functions of an effective state. The fourth, and these are all linked, it's not like any of these cause each other, these are all symptoms that manifest themselves from a whole variety of underlying reasons, is a very poor environment for private sector investment. And one of the challenges one faces in trying to chart a course out of state fragility is to find ways of getting private sector investment into the economy. The fifth was the economy being exposed to shocks with little resilience, meaning that even if you can put an economy on a better footing, even relatively small shocks appear to be able to derail progress. And one needs to think about building mechanisms to give a certain amount of resilience. And if you think about, in contrast, most of the developed world resisted the consequences, the major consequences of the financial crisis, has mechanisms in place so that those shocks can, to some extent, be coped with. But even much smaller shocks are liable to derail the situation when states are fragile. And then finally, deep divisions in the society. So one tries to build effective states on top of societies where there's at least some element of common purpose among the citizens towards the goals that state is trying to progress. But societies with deep underlying divisions make that very difficult. So of course, I've described a set of 6 criteria that might apply more or less to any place in the world. Even some states have been relatively successful will have manifestations of some of these aspects of fragility. One of the studies we commissioned up front was on attempts to predict fragility, meaning that if you ask the question, where in the world would you be able to get sort of the canary in the mine, if you like. For those of you who don't know that analogy, the miners used to take a canary down the mine because the bad gases would kill the canary before the miners, and so when you saw the canary fall over, you knew to get out. But very few people have come up with persuasive indicators of where we would expect fragility to emerge. A good example is pretty much nobody was predicting Syria ahead of time. And as far as I know, nobody has come up with a kind of formula that would tell us where to find these things. So it's not like we're trying to create through these criteria a simple way of doing that, but it is a complex business. Okay, I'm going to now briefly just run through some of our recommendations. There'll be only some of our recommendations, but I hope to give you a sense of how it is we're thinking about this. I'm going to talk a bit about some of our core recommendations on politics and security and some of our core recommendations on the economy. And I'm going to focus on the recommendations which mainly apply to international actors. It's a very complex matter, and I think Adnan touched on this in his opening comments, how one engages in this dialogue with the governments of the states that are deemed to be fragile by these criteria. The idea that we are somehow able to have leverage with them and to dictate to them what the strategies are that they should employ is a deeply difficult area. We feel much more comfortable, and we do touch on some of the ideas which we think are relevant, but we feel a lot more confident given the nature of our commission and where we're coming from, talking to the international community, because obviously that is to some extent the body that is responsive to the concerns of the developed world in its engagement with with other countries. And I'm going to offer a very brief high-level tour, as I said, mainly focusing on issues that we deem to be issues for international actors. So under transforming politics and security, there's something here, and I'll maybe just highlight it, perhaps partly in the interest of provocation, but actually there is a substantial point here, is that we think there's been insufficient focus in building checks and balances and its importance as a basis for creating a state which has common purpose. And we think that is a theme in a range of academic literature now, but we think also a relevant theme for thinking about the practical progress. And I'm going to say this, I'd say deliberately provocatively, but one could argue that the international community has been far too focused on speedily trying to run an election as the basis for trying to resolve what it thinks is a lack of government legitimacy, without thinking hard about the constraints on power that might be faced by an elected government, or the lack of constraints on power. And we think a lot more attention should have been paid historically to that. Of course, it's much harder to think how to do the equivalent of election monitoring for checks and balances. There is a sort of tried and trusted set of global practices for sending in election monitors and checking the election either passes or doesn't pass a certain set of tests for free and fair elections. There's no comparable monitoring process for establishing whether there's an effective and fairly run system of checks and balances, either on coming via the legal system. So we think this is an area where the lack of attention, and in some cases actually has been damaging. Running elections was a famous case where I think it's one of the elections in Afghanistan, and John Kerry showed up and tried to plead with them not to count the election results. Because he knew that it would only create more problems to actually know how the election votes had been cast, because it was only going to create more division at exactly a time when the focus should have been on trying to build strong coalitions of people to work together, and the election would actually act in the opposite direction rather than actually being a complement to that. And if you look at, for example, the way elections are conducted in Lebanon, it's very interesting. The Lebanese agreements about how to do power sharing are invoked once the election result has come, and in fact do not demand that the representation in the government follows the election outcome in any formulaic way. And that's been quite important, I think, in holding together what has been a very fragile situation. And so that's kind of one of the core messages, and there's had a certain amount of resonance in the discussion of the report, although a very cheap way of saying that is we don't like elections. That's far from true, and we're saying don't hold them. We're saying elections are fine, but you have to hold them in a context where they will resolve the kinds of issues. And if you think the fundamental issue is getting some kind of common purpose and common interest within the state, elections per se do not provide any guarantee that that will happen. Another theme, and I'll pull it out here, is in this Adnan again highlighted this, is that we think that there should be a lot more debate about process and less about end states. I mean, the end state, as everyone says, is to think of a sort of 30-point plan to get you from where you are now to Denmark in 10 years is not a helpful way of charting progress. I mean, of course, we all want to be there in the end, but we don't think that the way that sort of the way that's been. A very good example of that is, perhaps applies to one of my later slides, but I'll introduce it now, is the speed with which things like ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards are applied right up front, and can actually be a barrier to progress, because the states you're dealing with simply cannot be held to the kinds of standards that are deemed appropriate and have been evolved, particularly to please the electorates of the donor countries, because they want to give money feeling they're giving it in circumstances which respect the kinds of values and standards that are typical in their own countries, has actually been, we think, a barrier. And that's because those ESG standards are most often conceived as standards for a different political context, and not the context of the states that we're talking about here. Second set of recommendations come around security and the need to absolutely prioritize security. Now, security, short-term stabilizing security, obviously is something that one needs. It was effective in Sierra Leone and other places in stabilizing the situation. But we think that the sort of exit strategy from externally imposed security has not been given sufficient thought at the time that's done. Now, of course, in the point at which you're trying to stabilize a conflict situation, it may seem that that's the priority and you don't really care about the medium-term plan. But there's been a peacekeeping operation in Congo, as far as I recall, for something like 17 or 18 years, where nobody really from the start has been thinking, how do you make a transition from external peacekeeping towards domestic security? And we think that's got to be put up front much more than it has been in some of the discussion to date. We talk a lot about that in the report. Another feature of the report, and this is a difficult issue too, but it's to focus on the pivotal moments when you can make a difference. The international community obviously has to be there 24/7 somehow in relation to any country. We don't pick and choose where we operate to some extent. But there are some cases where a particular effort at a particular time has a lot better chance of success. So I would say, and this is an example actually where we're hoping to get some traction with our report, is the example of Zimbabwe presently. There's a huge opportunity to engage in Zimbabwe now, which may or may not be a window that's open for a while. It could be a long while or a short while. And one has to recognize those potential moments and make sure that the efforts are put in when they have the greatest chance of success. On the other hand, I would say that if we take, say, Venezuela right now, I would say that the opportunity for anybody internationally to influence the path of Venezuela, however much we may abhor the particular trajectory it's on, is really very limited. And we really need to think of ways of trying to focus our efforts on those moments when they come up, changes of government, changes of circumstance, and we talk around the issues. There's questions around when you, for example, put things like debt relief on the table and so forth. There are lots of nuances and subtleties around this, but we think this is an important thing. The other thing that we talk about a lot in the report is the need to spend time thinking about how you establish both limited and purposive long-term goals, and those which focus on accountability to citizens, not donors. One thing you hear time and time again is that the process of government is bound up very often in trying to keep donors happy to the neglect of keeping, or even trying to engage with keeping the citizens of a country happy, on the basis that donors are so important. And actually my good friend Ravi Kamba, I remember he spent time as the resident representative of the World Bank in Ghana, and he said it was just amazing that some 22-year-old from the IMF, maybe 26-year-old from the IMF could show up and get the full attention for 2 days of the finance minister, when the citizens were basically unable to get access to anybody of any authority. There was this absorption of the international, of the domestic government with trying to please, of course, very important international players, and the need to build a process that puts the interests of citizens. And of course, that's very easily said and hard to do, but we think that one of the reasons why these countries so often face setbacks is that as soon as the country is no longer subject to the degree of international attention, you haven't built any of the fabric, if you like, of an effective state underpinning. And part of an effective state is being accountable in very clear ways to citizens, not just in elections, but through the institutions of the state, the legal and parliamentary system as well. Okay, a word or two about the economy, and then I'll probably sit down. Yeah, I'm going to have to sit down, as my timekeeper is telling me. So one way we frame the issue is that there needs to be much more focus of the main objective of the economy being job creation. Now, of course, job creation, investment, they're all going hand in hand. But too much, and again, it's sort of an entirely obvious point that if you want to grow the economy, you've got to find vehicles for increasing the levels of private investment and job creation. That sort of goes without saying. But you need an agenda for doing that, but you also need an agenda that allows governments to develop their own programs. We think that the international community has been far too prescriptive. And let me give you a very interesting example came out of one of our evidence sessions. We had a representation from a high-level person of the Tunisian government. And the Tunisian government, the new Tunisian government came in, and of course they had to develop their own program. And they were listening, as you would expect, to lots of external international influence on what they should do. What they came up with as the #1 priority was cleaning the mosques. And they said nowhere would any donor have been at all happy about coming up with a priority that mosque cleaning was in any way, shape, or form a priority of government. But they said this enabled them to signal very clearly to a part of their population that was deeply suspicious about the direction of travel of that government policy, and was an entirely internally generated policy that came from the government recognizing the kinds of priorities that it had. And it required them to lean quite heavily against the international community's advice to them. It would never have emerged. Now, of course, that's a kind of cute example that's possibly not replicable widely, but I think it illustrates quite clearly the kind of idea of the need to get governments much better used to than they have been historically evolving their own policy priorities. Of course, they need advice and they need support and they need financial support for those priorities in particular. So we're not in any way, shape or form critical of the need to provide aid and support. But the source of the advice they're getting, I think, we think that the balance needs to be, the dial needs to be reset on the balance. We have a lot of sort of what you might call, to use an Americanism, inside baseball advice for the World Bank and IMF. I mean, the World Bank and IMF are very key players in engaging with situations of state fragility. We don't think and indeed by their own admission, their strategies for doing that right now have been deeply deficient in a wide number of ways. I suspect in this audience, unless it wants to come out of discussion, the ins and outs of how exactly they do that. But let me give you just one interesting example, and I'll sit down. Was the external evaluation group of the IMF were deeply critical of the fact that the IMF cannot get any of its really high quality staff to go and spend any of their time in the most difficult places that the IMF faces. The staff are much happier to go to Stockholm or Paris or wherever else and conduct Article 4 missions that tick box the public finances of those countries than they are able even to get people to go and work in the most difficult places. So that they recognize that now. Quite what they're going to do in terms of their human resource management policy to bring that about, I'm not entirely sure. But we've had a lot of buy-in and interest from both the IMF and World Bank, who now recognize themselves that their extant strategies for dealing with state fragility could be improved a great deal. Okay, I'm going to sit down now. I know I haven't given you anything close to a full overview. There's a few more recommendations, and I hope I might have given you enough to think that you might want to read and critique our report. But now actually the job of both critiquing our report falls to our two discussants, and I don't know what order. I was going to hand back to Adnan, who's going to keep order.
In fact, I'm going to request the panel to come on stage.
We're going to have Rachel and Roger talk to the stage. Okay, great. Yeah, anyone else? You see it's now great.
And Tim also, please. Wherever you can fit. Thanks, Tim. Let me now request Rachel Glennister, who is the Chief Economist at the Department for International Development and was earlier Executive Director of the Poverty Action Lab at MIT, which she helped set up and ran for a number of years, to not only respond to the ideas that were presented, but also share your perspective on these issues. Thanks, Rachel.
Great, thanks. It's great to be here, and it's great to respond to this report. I think it's, first I want to congratulate the Commission for a really provocative report. And I think in particular for taking this really important issue very seriously. I mean, so increasingly, poverty and poverty reduction is going to be about fragility. The estimates within DFID is something like 80% of the extreme poor will be in what are currently fragile states. And I know you don't like the list, but this is just, to give a sense of magnitude. 80% of extreme poverty will be in countries that are currently fragile. So increasingly over time, fragility and extreme poverty will be, very much the same thing. So it's really important that we think seriously, rigorously, and carefully about this issue. And I think that's what this report does. It also nicely, I think, brings together economic thinking and political economy thinking. We've had a bit of an overview of some of the recommendations, and I guess I would say the ones that most challenge the international community, a number of them I think I strongly support, and some I have, I would put slightly differently. So I'm going to quickly run through those and give a bit of a take on them. One of them that I strongly support and have seen work quite well in Sierra Leone, where I've done a lot of research over the years, was delivering some quick wins. And that, in particular, you can get, there's various approaches people can do to get money out quickly. And I've recently went back to some of those programs that provided some quick wins in Sierra Leone and encouragingly found that they still have persistent effects on the economy many years later. The second one that I think we can all agree on is the importance of not overloading countries with a long list of conditions. And I think there, the interesting thing is, what do we do about it? Because as you say, everyone says that when you go to, there's this mantra that we shouldn't overload countries with conditions. I guess I'm struggling with what can we specifically do to change that process, and partly that's working with places like the IFIs. That's where I feel like there's more concrete, specific things that we can work on. But I don't think that's the only part of not overloading countries with, very long agendas, because, fragility is about not being able to deliver effectively in a country. Why then do we give those exact countries a kind of longer list of conditions than other places? Clearly that's the wrong answer, but I think we need a little bit more thinking about what are the incentives within the system that lead us to be doing that. Don't build a state, have donors help build a state rather than build a parallel system to the state. In a sense, is kind of obvious. If we're about state building, why are we constantly providing money that sets up parallel systems? Yes, I think everyone agrees with that. In practice, it's quite hard to do. So let's keep working and thinking, and I think it's a good challenge to us to do it, though. Support the government agenda rather than come with your own agenda. And then there again, I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think the challenge is that in a lot of these countries, it's not clear what the government agenda is. The government agenda is 500 priorities, which then allows the donors to pick the one of the 500 that they want to do, which of course is picking their priorities, right? So what do you do when you're faced with a government that is not able to coordinate and come up with its prioritized agenda? And that's the practical question that we face. And I think, one of the ways to do that is to do better donor coordination that says, this is the pot of money that we together can do, what's your list of priorities? I would note, though, however, if you get that greater donor coordination on one side, it helps with forcing the government to prioritize. It also changes the bargaining position. It reduces the bargaining position of the government because you've got this one coordinated block. So that's, I think, an interesting dilemma about how do we deliver when the government is not, it's so fragile that it's not able to come up with a list of priorities. Let me turn to the bits where I guess I have maybe a slightly different, so all of those I agree with the report, and I think there's some practical implementation challenges. Let me turn to the bits where I would maybe take a slightly different view, and I think a lot of us are influenced by the experience of the fragile states we've worked in. We have that kind of bias, so you talked, Tim, about the power sharing and not immediately jumping to winner-take-all elections. And this is, as you mentioned, one of the recommendations in the report that has sort of generated a lot of discussion. And I guess I have 2 points on that. One is that I've seen situations where elections can build a sense of ownership and community and accountability, that, and the checks and balances. I agree it's not always, you can't, sometimes it's problematic. In particular, a lot of the work that I've been involved in has been looking at how even when you have countries where voting is very ethnically based, it's still the case that people assume in that case that elections aren't providing any any accountability. And yet we see in the data that people will change based on how well the government is doing. So we recently saw the second change in power in Sierra Leone. Second change since the war. And that's become part of the identity of Sierra Leone, is that we do democracy, right? It's part of the identity of India that we manage to do democracy at a very poor level. So, and in India, again, people vote very ethnically, and yet you see people willing to change their vote on the basis of, for accountability reasons if the government isn't delivering. So how do we do check? Maybe, let's not throw away elections as part of that checks and balances. I know that's not what you're saying, but I'm just kind of challenging us to say, just because there's clear ethnic positions in a country doesn't mean that you can't make elections work. And second, on the elections point, we don't have a very good way. If we delay elections, I don't think we've got a great way to transition into democracy later. You talked about openings, when there's an opening for movement, and the end of a war is such a moment where you can really change things. If you get things going in a power sharing agreement, or you say that elections will create ethnic tensions, so we're not going to require it of you. We've got a number of examples of countries that are not, this has gone on for a long time, and the international community said, yep, we understand, we don't need elections, and yet they're finding it really hard to transition. So I think we need to think really carefully about what's that transition path going to look like, because you don't want 20 years down the line the tensions to re-emerge because you failed to do the transition. So let's think about that transition. I'll just end with a comment on the IFIs, because partly in response to what you were saying, and partly because I think there's some really concrete things that we can take some of these recommendations and really do some very concrete things in how they work. And again, maybe we won't get into the technical point, but this argument that, as you say, if your Fragility Commission, if it says anything, it's about you've got to understand the local context, understand the politics of the situation. And the IFIs are not putting people into these countries. They don't have people based in these countries usually to really understand the local context. And that's what the Independent Evaluation Office beef with the IFIs was about, really. That was one of their big recommendations. So how can you understand those complicated politics and figure out what the few key conditions are going to be if you're not there? And as you say, they're finding it really hard to get the good people to work on these countries. I don't think that's an HR. I don't think it's that complicated. We're getting all sorts of pushback from them about it's not complicated. There's some really good economists who work on fragility. It's seen as very, when I think back to my MIT days, we had top people at MIT, PhDs, working on the DRC. It was sexy, it was interesting, it was important. They're not going to the IMF because the IMF is signaling they're not interested in it. And having worked in the IMF, I can tell you it's not a complicated HR thing. If the people get the signal about what's important by what the managing director cares about and which meeting the managing director chairs. If she were to chair only the fragile state discussions, people would go work on those countries overnight, right? It's not that complicated.
Thank you, Rachel. Great points. We'll come back to some of these. Before I introduce Roger, let me give a forewarning to several people in the audience. Several people who have great original ideas that hopefully will bring them into the discussion. People like Torsten, Robin, Eliana, Oriana, Matt Jackson, Joachim. There are many people in the audience who should ideally be part of the discussion. Hopefully, Tim, maybe you'll be best placed to bring them into the discussion. It's my honor to introduce, although it doesn't need any introduction, Roger Myerson, Professor of Economics, Glenn Lloyd, Professor of Economics at University of Chicago.
I think this is an important report. By the way, the focus on, let's recognize that the development of political institutions is has to be a priority in helping the poorest and most difficult developed nations to develop. It's one that seems right to me. I forgot the name of Stuti Kamani's World Bank report that I think is another report that takes this focus, and I applaud that.
Politics work for the poor.
Which it was about 2 years ago. Another important report, and this is the IGC is I think much to be applauded. So I'm on the panel because I agree with most of this stuff. I'd like to suggest what I think is like a 20% change in the focus, and so I'll emphasize that. I would say, I think, what makes us, we talk about root causes, what makes a state fragile. I think the fragility can be of two natures. One is elite networks are too narrow to govern effectively, or on the other hand, there may be rivalries between different groups in the country that have prevented a consolidation of an effective state. In either case, the international community may bear some of the root cause blame, whatever the history of the country is. Narrowness, I would argue, can be inadvertently caused by international assistance that channels resources exclusively through the national government, because that enables national leaders to, by controlling the resources that they get from the international donors that don't require taxes and bureaucratic machinery in the nation itself, to retain their privileged position in the capital without bothering to negotiate a broader political coalition that includes local elites in the more remote provinces. On the other hand, the international, destabilizing rivalries can be perpetuated when when rivals in the host country get financial and military assistance from different countries internationally, which are thus exporting their international rivalry into the domestic chaotic politics of the recipient country. I would argue that the main thesis I want to make about what a strong state really looks like is a strong state needs a balanced constitutional relationship between national political leaders and autonomous leaders who have support in local politics. Successful states, I think, if you look around the world, one way or another, commonly devolve somewhere between a quarter to a half, let's say a third, of public spending to subnational government officials who are subject to national law but owe their positions to local politics. That, to me, is the important point about politics in successful societies that needs to be borne in mind when thinking about the political development of poorer countries. I would argue that this guideline needs to be encouraged by international assistance. The report observes, I've got some quotes in front of me, institutions matter in shaping how governments acquire and use their power. Formal rules shape interactions between governments and citizens. Another quote, the acid test of effectiveness of checks and balances is if they reassure citizens. The focus of the report is on the view and there's a lot about checks and balances. I want to say more about this, that it is the focus, the development of checks on national authority. Actually, let me say right now that I think Tim said very well that the idea, it's dangerous, it can do harm to rush a society into its first national elections when the society hasn't done the work to create some effective, credible and effective checks on the power that will be accrued to the winner of this first national election in a country that has not had national elections before. That can do harm, and we need to be worried about this. So checks and balances is something discussed a lot, but in the quotes, the acid test of checks and balances, the report suggests, is if they reassure citizens. I would suggest that maybe is the wrong focus. How could that be the wrong focus? Of course it's. Look, let me talk about England. In the history of this country, I'd say in the decade or two after the Battle of Hastings, I think you'd have to say that there was a strong leader of this country, but it looked like he was covering over a fragile state, a narrow support. Now ask, what was the first institutional development that brought that fragile monarchy and made it a strong monarchy? If you look at your medieval history, there's absolutely clear what that development was. It was the development of the Court of the Exchequer in the 12th century. And the Court of the Exchequer was not about guaranteeing Saxon rights against Norman whatever. It was about regulating the relationship between the central government and the agents of the government in the provinces. It was about regulating the relationship between guaranteeing a certain balance of power between the treasurer as a representative of the central government and the sheriffs who were the provincial governors. In the 13th and 14th century, the power of this country grew even more when the institution of Parliament evolved, which was again not about guaranteeing the rights of the people. It was about guaranteeing the positions of the local governments, of the town councils and the rural gentry who were the local government, and guaranteeing them a stake and a protected stake in national politics. So rather than saying reassure citizens, I think the reality is it's about reassuring lower levels of a political class. It's about reassuring local leaders that they have a stake in the national government political system. The report argues that establishing a viable sequence of change is critical, and I think that the conceptual structure that's laid out is so transforming politics and security comes first, and obviously security has to come first. Help build a government that is subject to checks and balances, the report suggests, while helping to build domestic security. I have to say, talking about security with checks and balances makes it sound like we're talking about disciplined soldiers and police along with lawyers and judges. But I would argue that it all begins with a better political process. The first focus has to be on political leaders who mobilize active supporters by distributing patronage and protection. It sounds wrong. Establishing fragility begins with a negative agenda of building checks and balances, the report suggests. And this is so that people in different groups can feel confident that state power will not be used against them, which is, I think, a compelling logical argument. And only then can a positive agenda of building a national sense of common purpose begin for achieving mutual gains. It's also suggested, by the way, that among checks and balances, quote, probably the most important, most critical restraint will be whether a group has a veto on authorization of public spending. This sounds like it maybe is right, but it sounds like it's the wrong direction. We have a fragile, weak state, and we're supposed to think that the first step in building state effectiveness is building safeguards. Yes, that paradoxically may well be right, but the veto power, by building credible veto power, that sounds wrong, and I want to suggest it is wrong. I won't. How can you if one is involved in a process that's going to build a strong state and there's no elections, then as Rachel said, it's going to be harder to introduce elections later on, only harder. And yet, if the first elections are just going to give all power to whoever wins, then it becomes a dangerously zero-sum game, and the fear that whoever wins will take dictatorial power and suppress the opposition is certainly not a positive development. How does one not hold back on elections and yet build the checks and balances before the elections? And the answer, of course, is this should have been obvious. For example, in the Arab Spring in Egypt, is to hold local elections before the national elections, to empower to have a positive agenda of. We should be concerned about the first step to strengthening the state as a negative one that seems to weaken it. Let me say, when Madison was arguing, the phrase checks and balances, I don't know if James Madison coined it, but I think he certainly popularized it in the discourse. And I'm sure that the authors of the report were partly responding to the wonderful Federalist Papers, of which James Madison was not the only author, but the principal, but the most prolific one. And certainly the most important author of the Constitution of the United States, with all of its pluses and minuses. But when Madison was developing the fundamental importance of checks and balances in his discourse about the Constitution of the United States, he was considering a nation where decentralization of substantial power to autonomous provincial governments was already an established fact. In fact, it was the established fact. In fact, sitting in London, I have to observe the whole point of the American Revolution was not about liberty or democracy. It was about the rights of provincial assemblies. That was what they were fighting for. And, it was when in 1789, it was the background. James Madison understood that negative checks on powerful officials could only be exercised effectively by others with a share in the distribution of power. He knew, as in Federalist 46, that the power of the American provincial governments would be a primary check on officials of the new federal government. Such a distribution of balanced distribution of power did exist in the fragile state of America in 1785, but it does not typically exist in the fragile states where narrow national elites have tried to keep a monopoly of power in much of the world today. Then devolving power to local councils that are based on local politics should be a positive first step towards strengthening the base of the state, as local leaders in every part of the country will thereby acquire a stake in the political system that makes them willing to help defend it. This positive step can also help guarantee the rights of national minority groups where they have a share of local power in districts where they happen to be concentrated. That might not work for Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, who I think are, but furthermore, ambitious local leaders who exercise autonomous local power will then find that they have an incentive to that they can build support to compete for higher office by developing a reputation for using power to serve the public more broadly, and thus they will make local leaders, among others, will have an incentive, a positive political incentive to use their local power to make the common agenda more salient in politics, which is the second great step in the report's political agenda. Let me say, I think, to conclude, I think when fragile states fail, we've seen that the result may be to drive populations into flight toward the successful pluralist nations of the West. And whatever people are saying in America, it is Europe that would be the destination of the populations of the huge fragile states, for example, in Africa, if they were to fail and drive out a large fraction of their population as refugees from civil war. There has been much, I would argue, nobody has tried to actually, as far as I can tell, develop a cadre of people who are ready, of agents who are ready to work as a team to help rebuild politics on a balanced basis between local and national politics. We talked about that the state building, when the state is part of the problem, statecraft diplomats as well as development people as well as military involved, but diplomats typically focus on national and international politics, not on subnational and local politics. And the point in state building is the relationship between national and local politics, I've tried to argue. Let me say, there has been such state-building expertise in this country. a couple of generations ago among the many district magistrates of colonial service and the political officers of the British Army who were experts in applying limited external resources from the imperial or international community in negotiations with local leaders to support local and national political development. Such expertise, I would argue, is needed and can be developed again. I would argue that there's no better place for such a unit to be based than in London, that it could be done for a cost that is less than 1% of the current British defense budget. Gertrude Bell built a state that was far more durable than our invasion did in 1920. Gertrude Bell built a state of Iraq that was far more durable than anything that our coalition was able to do, and she really was basing on less than 100 political officers who were. I would argue that there's no better organization, let me conclude, to sponsor such a state-building organization far better maybe than the government of my country, than the Commonwealth of Nations that could oversee such, and I'm saying this to lobby Adnan.
Okay. Where do we throw
Thanks,
that?
Roger. Does any member of the panel want to come back on any of the points, or should we open
let's
up?
open up to the floor. We've got so many interesting people with views on the floor, so we should give them an opportunity to comment.
So anyone from the audience? Yes, please.
I think they're a roving mic. I will come back.
Yeah. So one question I had, which pertains to the whole issue of elections and checks and balances. Have you given any thought, if we think about elections, whether we want to think about the design of the type of election? So, for example, considering proportional representation systems with a parliamentary system kind of already builds in some form of power sharing by the need to build coalitions. Of course, they presuppose some type of party structure and so forth. But I think one thing that we see, like in many recent democracies, they tend to converge upon presidential democracies, and what we're seeing in Eastern Europe, all the way down to Turkey and so forth, there's a tendency for them to now kind of go into the other side where the presidential structure is trying to assume more power. Same we see in Latin America and so forth. So the combination of parliamentary democracy plus proportional representation, when we think about this from an institutional design point of view.
Can I make a brief comment? I completely agree that presidentialism is by and large rather dangerous. And if you look at it historically, for example, in Africa, without being too generous about this, most presidential systems that were created out of parliamentary systems had one very simple purpose, which was to entrench the power of particular leaders. So think of Kwame Nkrumah. I mean, I could think of contemporary examples that would be more politically edgy, but in Ghana, Nkrumah basically converted the parliamentary system that originally prevailed in Ghana into a presidential system with a very clear sense that it would be much easier for him to remain in power and to accumulate power as a president. And I think this is a pattern you see. You mentioned Turkey, and there are many examples. And I'm not sure quite where one takes that idea. I mean, in terms of international pressure, in terms of constitution design, but it's, I think, a very relevant point in the discussion.
Well, yeah, I think obviously nations. A functioning nation makes its own sovereign choices about its political constitution by internal politics. But when the international community is taking responsibility for making possible the existence of a state in the extreme emergency cases, it seems there is a general problem, and there's nothing like Somalia to look to show, of how do you make sure that the people you've identified as local leaders you're giving support to actually have a base in local politics. And that is a reason for wanting to encourage democracy, even without our having democracy at home, to have elections. But let me say, I think that argues for a parliamentary form of responsibility, both at the national level and at the local level, because then it's the executive of authority at the national level and the executive authority at the local level who are receiving international money. Their political position is being strengthened thanks to international support, and making sure that if they are only responsible to occasional elections every X years, then you run the the terrible risk that you're supporting somebody who's only really responsible to the international community now. Whereas at least if they're responsible, if they can be dismissed at any time under parliamentary responsibility by a national council or for a prime minister or a parliamentary responsibility for the chief executive of a provincial or municipal council also, then you can guarantee that there is a somewhat larger and broader group of people who genuinely still are willing to support the continued power of the person who's managing the money that you're giving them.
So just joining up something that Rachel said, and then Roger also said, the thing that I'm not hearing is, so clearly the quick wins thing is important and where those quick wins are delivered. But throughout, there's been a sort of focus on politicians and very little focus on bureaucrats. And typically what happens when you actually implement anything, when you provide something to the population or you make something work, it's the bureaucrats that do that. And so I'm just wondering whether there's some element of, you say state capacity has to be improved. The truth in these countries is that state capacity is gone for large parts of the geography. And whether there's some, and then additionally you have this problem that the best of the state capacity, at least at the top, is being harvested by the donors and so forth. So whether there's some way that you can configure or provide a better training or produce some new bureaucrats who are actually going to be able to do something across the whole territory, partly at the behest of politicians below the national level. And that seems like something that's fairly, uncontroversial, I guess is one way to put it, and how that would fit in with the sort of political reforms you've been describing.
I think Adnan should reply to that. They've done a lot of work on bureaucracy.
Yeah, maybe
Rachel as well.
maybe Rachel should also respond to it. Yeah, I think from my narrative perspective, I think the key to building state capacity in these fragile settings is bringing new people into both the political space through local elections and others, and also bringing new people or changing the culture of existing employees in government. The latter is very hard, as we know, could have big returns, but it's very hard to do. Bringing new people with a new organizational culture is potentially one way to go. However, we know far too little about what to do and far too much about what not to do, especially in these settings where the limited capacity that we have is often sucked by donors and other agencies. And often there is a path dependence in doing things, hiring people on higher salaries or other, like having parallel state structures, which is, just to give you an example of Afghanistan, more than 2/3 of the budget is basically delivered by parallel state structures funded by international. There are 14 different agencies which are dealing with the anti-corruption agenda. That's not the way to build state capacity. Motivating existing civil servants, and as Oriana and Eliana over in the audience would tell, is one of the possible ways to go. And hard as it is, in the initial years of post-conflict reconstruction, one of the best sources of doing that is attracting diaspora. So it has been done in some places like Liberia, a few other places, provide the best, at least in the short run, key source of human capital. I don't know if Rachel has anything to it.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about it at a couple of different levels. So there's bringing back the diaspora and other approaches can work for kind of that top level capacity that you need. And there's often, immediately post-war a kind of patriotic feeling that I ought to go back and help rebuild this country. There's also the question of quick wins lower down. So this is, the example I talked about where I've done some research on community-driven development. And I think, so where there's been quite a lot of research, and I think some of that literature has been a bit misread, to be honest, because originally the idea of providing community-driven development was to provide money at a very local level and try and make the processes at the local level more, open and have women's have more voice. And it was completely failed to do all of those things. What it actually was quite good at doing was just getting money down to the ground and letting communities build things that they needed immediately after the war. And so again and again, we've seen in those evaluations that it was actually quite effective at doing that. Now, in the case that I studied, that was actually the process that was done was through new districts. So there was this decentralization, and I just want to pull up on that again. I think that was an important part of the process to make the elections not winner-take-all, because yes, they were winner-take-all at the national level, but you had the local areas that the opposition could retreat to, and they could prove that they were doing a good job in their areas, which I think was really important. And similarly, at the same time, and not something that we evaluated, but something I observed, was the bank just said to those districts, which were completely new immediately after the war, they just gave them some money and said, not a whole lot of conditions, just do the thing. They called it rapid results, and they just said, do one thing that you want to do, and here's some money, and get on with it. And the objective was to help them learn how to use money and learn on the job, in a sense, but not wait until they'd set up, tax systems and all the other things. They just said, pretty low stakes. It wasn't a lot of money. Here's some money, and we'll just help you think about how to do project appraisal and prioritization, just really basic things. We didn't evaluate that, but it was interesting to observe that as an example of a quick win, and it was very explicit from the bank to do that as a way to learn on the job. At this lower level, where really, we're not talking about bringing in the diaspora, it was really just local people kind of standing up for election in their local area. Again, though, we have to be a little bit conscious that different countries have different, local organizing ability, right? So in some places, the national state may have broken down, but locally, everyone knows how to organize. And that's different in different places. Sometimes that local organization has broken down as well, and that's very different from the places where the national state has broken down. But locally, people are, they know who's in charge, and they know who's handing out land, and a lot of traditional African countries that, still rely on chieftain systems. And so, always being conscious of these different levels of authority.
Everything that's good about in the long run about federal decentralization of power begins with hard budget constraints, and in that sense, one should absolutely recognize that political decentralization. The success of political decentralization depends essentially on that most centralized of national government agencies, the Ministry of Finance. The ability of a Ministry of Finance to reliably handle the cash flow between the central government and provincial budgetary authorities is absolutely central. Ashraf Ghani has argued that well, and let me just say in the history of this country, again, I mentioned the Court of the Exchequer as something that was about creating the basis for provincial autonomous government in Britain. But of course, it was the Exchequer as the Ministry of Finance. It was about making those flows of money between the center and the provinces reliably and monitored, so that the local government, the provincial governments at that time, could then have a certain amount of political autonomy and count on that. Sorry.
So I'd like to get your views on a slightly different take on the role of international factors. And we tend to focus a lot on the internal causes of state fragility and see the international community as being out there to help. But then I think this fragility creates a very peculiar pattern of economic gains and losses in these countries. There are economic actors that benefit from barriers to entry. They have incredible rents. And so, to what extent there are true interests in ending some of the conflicts or resolving the fragility situation. I don't think it's something that we can take for granted. And it always strikes me how there's a bit of disconnect between the efforts we put on the academic side on certain topics and what you hear in these countries from the local people. So I was curious to see whether the Commission had considered any of these points raised often by advocacy groups or other sources, if you think there's a basis for them and if they should become part of the agenda for resolving fragility.
Tim, maybe you should
I'll make one or two comments, but I'm not sure I have a satisfactory response, and I'm racking my brains to know how far we ever discussed in all of our discussions something relevant to this. But let me tell you where I think I complete sympathy with, I think, what you were saying. We kind of begin with an assumed benevolence of those who are out there trying to help, and that their motives we used to complain, as economists at least, that we always assume that about government. Government would be benevolent, it's fixing the failures of the market. Now I think there's an assumed benevolence very often in these debates, the international actors, which of course during the Cold War period there was a very different take, and if you look at the geopolitics that was operative in that era, and of course arguably it suppressed a lot of the issues around fragility because there was a geopolitical reason to stabilize regions of the world would otherwise have been more problematic than they actually were. So in fact there is this, some people in the room may know a lot more about it than I do, argument that actually the Cold War was very important in dealing with the conflict issues precisely for that reason. Now, in terms of the modern world, of course, you didn't say this, but the issue of Chinese intervention in Africa and the assumed motives around that is something in a huge amount of discussion. And of course, people acknowledge on both sides that there's beneficial effects of this, infrastructure has been built, other things happen as a consequence of that. But equally, the desire that comes with that to maintain certain kinds of network relationships with existing politicians who are favorable towards the deals that have been struck is the flip side of that. To be honest with you, unless Adnan corrects me or Robin corrects me as members of the Commission, I don't think we did have a huge... I guess we were implicitly placing ourselves in a view that the global community is in fact trying to act benevolently, at least the players that we're trying to influence, the IMF, DFID, whoever it might be. But I think you're raising an important meta issue that I'm not sure we've really discussed at length.
Yeah, exactly. We did discuss a little bit with Jim Farron in particular. Places or situations where disorder is by design. Think of Mobutu's DRC. And we struggle quite a lot about what to do in those places. And not that external actors, we as outsiders, have any right to say anything to the Zairians or the Malawians. Even less so in places like DRC, where disorder is by design. In other places, yes, we have maybe some role in not suggesting prescriptions, in at least catalyzing new thinking within policy actors domestically. But I'm not sure. We did discuss, but we didn't come to a firm conclusion as to what do we do in situations like this. I don't know if others...
Can I just add, you sort of assume that maybe Eliana was talking about China. I would say maybe that's not... People often jump to worrying about China and infrastructure. And I think there's a lot of other places where we might have to worry about the internal dynamics of the incentives for continuing fragility. So, that might be actors in the government that we're worrying about. Like, to some extent, this will do what the government wants. One of the things that has definitely come back from some of our country offices is, well, what do you and some of our conflict advisors to that recommendation is, well, you're kind of assuming a benevolent government. And, what if the government wants conflict to continue, or some actors in the government want conflict to continue? another place where I think we're getting some really interesting and difficult dynamics is Somalia, where we've got, a number of different Gulf states kind of backing different bits of the government in Somalia, and that raises some really complicated issues in terms of, is it going to become a proxy war for a number of other countries? So I think those are the things that I worry about more. Now, it's also the case that Western countries back, would prefer certain outcomes in certain elections and not necessarily want to go with the will of the people. So, we also have to question ourselves. So let's be open to the wide range of external actors who might not always have the interests of the population completely at heart.
I think we are running out of time, so if Tim, if you allow, maybe we can collect a few questions, then have a final round, and then before giving the floor to Brenda.
Thank you. So thanks for this wonderful presentation. I just was wondering whether there was some, it's a question about low-hanging fruit. So there are instances, without putting too much of a gloss over them, but things like Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, Kagame's attempts to eliminate too much racial disharmony, comparisons of Kenya with Tanzania in terms of how they dealt with internal dissent. Or I'm wondering, has the Commission thought, is there other things that are less difficult to manage than elections that might help alter people's beliefs as to what represents, to start believing in a government which is inclusive and representative? And maybe some of the examples of low-hanging fruit might come from the West as well, for Canada's difficulties in dealing with Indigenous people or Me Too movements. Are there other ways of dealing with this which are much lower hanging fruit, and have you thought about that?
I really wish Paul Collier was here. I'll tell you why.
Should we collect a few more questions? Or
if there's more questions, I'll collect them, otherwise I'll respond.
Yes.
Just a very quick question. Aren't we hinging a lot on the political will to actually escape state fragility, given how much economic gains some of these politicians, particularly who benefit from this fragility, can make out of it?
Any last words from the members of the Commission on these questions, or anything else before we close?
Can I come a little bit? I'll actually answer both of these before my fellow panelists may have reactions. So I said I wish Paul Collier was here because he had some wonderful examples he's used in meetings I've been in. Indeed, in meetings with, one case with the president of a country, I won't name which one, on the issue of how you convince people that you really are trying to turn the country around and have a sense of mission. And he uses an example from, I think it's Singapore, where the new Singaporean government came in and the leader of the government jailed a bunch of own campaign supporters for corruption. And that this was a credible and clear signal. It's not about jailing your enemies. Anyone can jail your enemies. Jail your friends. Maybe not arbitrarily, but strategically. Sends an altogether different signal than jailing your enemies. And there have been clear examples history where friends of leaders have been subject to clear lines of accountability. This can be an incredibly powerful way of signaling intent. And Paul has a whole raft of such examples, trots out, discussion. Future reference if he's not going to show up. Make careful notes and trot out in his absence. But I think there's something powerful in that message, that new leaders often face that dilemma because they aren't often just supported by well-meaning people who support them for a variety of agendas. And cleaning your own house can be important. On the political will issue, that's where I very much come back to Roger's point. I think the history of delivery by leaders forging that accountability for success is much easier to do at the level of local politics than it is at national. I mean, sometimes creating political will and accountability and some positive relationship between delivery and political success can be done at the national level. But I think if you think of the sort of history of municipal government in particular in a number of countries, effective local leaders who've delivered on the most basic of public goods and been receiving electoral rewards creates a kind of self-fulfilling, or can create a kind of self-fulfilling and positive relationship between delivery and outcomes. And that's where I think that I'm in sympathy with some of what Roger was saying. It's much harder to do that same level of create that political will in consort with political success at a national program level. It can be done, but it's much more unlikely.
Roger, do you have any final comments?
Can I just pick up on the Truth and Reconciliation Committee thing, which is not only as so I'm a bit worried about that for two reasons. One is there is some evidence that going through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission process can actually re-traumatize people by talking about the trauma. And the second one is I've seen it used to jail the opposition and, take down any, in a situation where basically everyone did something bad, which we're often talking about. Sometimes it can lead to delegitimizing the only potential leaders that you have. So that's my worry about it. And as well as this kind of at a lower level, you actually can re-stimulate trauma by getting people to talk through it. I'm not saying never do it, but those are my concerns about it.
Just conclude, I think I want to, on the question of the international community doing harm, I think the Libyan case study is a very interesting one where clearly at the beginning there was very little coordination of the military assistance to the rebellion against Gaddafi, and so it wasn't, nobody thought in the international community that we had to worry very much about the fact that Qatar and the Emirates were systematically funding rival militia factions and creating the seeds, which then created a vested interest in fighting that has plagued Libya ever since. They were creating the seeds of the Libyan problems that exist to this day. The crucial mistake may have been when the elected National Assembly voted to fund the militias from the oil revenue, rather than, and nobody seems to have suggested from the international community, maybe it would be better to have that money go to the elected municipal councils, which then existed and typically included representatives from the rival militias that existed in the same city, and let the municipal councils take responsibility for recruiting a coherent local policing force, rather than just paying whoever happened to be under arms based on the fact that they were under arms, which was a convenient solution but did nothing for so there's different ways of decentralizing. I just would, and here I'd like Rachel perhaps to take one last check, because I think an excellent case study that I don't know enough about is the success in Sierra Leone after a totally grim history before that, as I know from Will Reno's book. And I believe absolutely decisive is that the international aid community, beginning of course with Britain, which was the lead, as one member of the international leader was responsible for a state building mission in 2002, was involved directly with the district level of government. And the international community felt it had to support not just the national government of Sierra Leone, but also the 20 or so district governments. And that balanced involvement was a different kind of force in Sierra Leone politics from the previous one, where the president had a monopoly on access to international assistance, and the country went downhill after independence.
Thank you, Roger. I think we are out of time. Let me hand over to Rebecca.
My job is simply to thank everyone. And so let's begin by please join me in thanking the panelists today. It was a fascinating, timely, and incredibly important discussion. It's really a pleasure to be here on behalf of CIFAR, to be with my colleagues John Hepburn and Kate Getty and Hilary Connolly and Amy Cook, who were so instrumental in pulling today together, to also to be here with so many of our CIFAR fellows in our program and institutions, organizations, and growth, and most notably our program director, Torsten Persson, who's here with us today. And I would very much like to thank all of you on their behalf for joining with us in this important discussion. As Tim mentioned, CIFAR's mission is really about bringing together the best minds from around the world, across disciplines and across sectors, to address questions of importance to the world. Our program and institutions, organizations, and growth does that. It's a truly stellar example of that work, and today's discussion really affirms that important role that they play for us at CIFAR. I'd also like to thank our partners, the British Academy, and particularly the International Growth Centre at the LSE. It's a pleasure to partner with you, and I hope we can find an opportunity to do it again in the future. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and I have one request of you, and that is that you will receive an email from us. Please take 1 minute and fill out a very quick survey. Tell us about this event, what worked, and that's really helpful to us as we think about what we can do moving forward. And finally, I hope you will all join us for the reception that follows, where we can continue the discussion. Thank you.